Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I'll be hanging out with you today as we continue on in our series about water. Today's topic is going to be water use. So as always, let me get you some objectives and we'll get going. By the end of this video, I'll be able to discuss the different ways that humans use water and describe some water conservation strategies. So for the last couple of videos, we've talked about the nuts and bolts of water. Today, we're going to talk about ways that humans use water and ways that we can conserve water. So if we're talking about all of that fresh water that is available to us in the world, not very much fresh water available as we talked about in a past video, but talking about that fresh water, if we break it down into ways that humans use it, about 70% of the fresh water in the world is used for agriculture, 20% is used for industrial purposes, and 10% is used in households. And we're going to go through, and for the next couple minutes, we're going to break down a little bit more about each one of those categories of usage. Starting out with agriculture. Like I said, agriculture is responsible for 70% of water use in the world. That water is used to raise livestock and to produce crops. And one of the biggest things when we talk about agriculture water use is irrigation, the watering of plants and crops. So I'm going to go ahead and go through some different types of irrigation. There is furrow irrigation, flood irrigation, spray irrigation, and drip irrigation. It's important to know these because each one is different from the others. Each one is more or less efficient than the others, and this is the major use of water because obviously plants need water in order to grow. So starting out with furrow irrigation. Furrow irrigation is the oldest form of irrigation. It is the simplest. You simply just dig a furrow down the middle of your field and then flood that furrow with water. It's nice because it's inexpensive, but it's also only 65% efficient. So that means that if you were to flood that furrow with 100 gallons of water, 65 gallons of the water would actually be available to the plants. The other 35% would either run off the land or evaporate. So furrow irrigation, it's easy, it's cheap, and it's 65% efficient. Getting slightly more efficient, we have got flood irrigation. Flood irrigation is simply the practice of flooding the entire field. So again, this is a pretty easy thing to do, but because you're flooding the entire field, it can be disruptive to plant growth. Only certain types of crop are going to be able to grow under this type of irrigation, and regarding efficiency, it's between 70 and 80% efficient, so it's a little bit more efficient than furrow irrigation. And then stepping on up the efficiency ladder, we have got spray irrigation, and this is big sprinklers spraying water over the top of a field. It is expensive, obviously, because you have to pay for the irrigation system, you got to pay for those sprinklers. You also have to use some energy to pump water up out of a well and then spray it across the field. But regarding efficiency, with spray irrigation, we are between 75 and 95% efficient. So we've moved on up that efficiency ladder. And the most efficient form of irrigation, and this would be the one that, like, if AP asks you some irrigation question, you want to talk about drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is a practice where a hose is run along the ground, and at each plant there's a small hole poked in the hose, so just little drips of water drip out onto the roots of the plant. Now, the hoses may be above ground, they may be below ground. Either way, it's a hose dripping on the plant. It can reduce weed growth if those hoses are laid underground because the topsoil stays pretty dry, so weeds can't germinate, but the plants still get the water that they need. And regarding efficiency, drip irrigation is over 95% efficient. So most of the water that is let out of these hoses actually gets used by the plants. Now, while we're talking about water and producing crops, let's talk about hydroponics real quick. Hydroponics is a really interesting system where you have plants grown indoors under greenhouse conditions. Rather than being in soil, they are grown in a nutrient-rich water solution. That water solution can be continuously circulated, so rather than consuming a ton of water, you are simply reusing the water that you have. It is highly efficient in that you can produce a lot of food per acre this way, but obviously you can see the setup there is pretty complicated, so this can be an expensive way to produce food. But it's a way to produce food that doesn't use as much land, it doesn't use as much resources. So looking forward towards producing food for a growing population, this might be one method that could be a viable strategy to address the problem of growing population. Let's go ahead and move on to industry. When we talk about water use in industry, we are talking about primarily manufacturing and electricity generation. So I'm going to hit on each of those for just a second. With electricity production, This is 50% of American water consumption. So we use a lot of water in order to produce our electricity. And when we talk about electricity and water, we need to talk about water that is consumed versus water that is not consumed. So water that is not consumed is water that goes into the plant, is used, and then discharged back to its original source. So an example of this would be a hydroelectric power plant where the water is stored in the reservoir, it runs through the turbines, and then heads back out into the river. So that would be water that is not consumed. Now, that's not saying that water isn't altered. It might get heated up, chemical composition of it might get changed, but ultimately it's going to end up back in the source, as opposed to water that is consumed. In thermal power plants, we had talked about you heat up water to boil it, you produce steam, that steam turns the turbine. After that steam turns the turbine, some of it is condensed and reused, but a large proportion of it exits to the atmosphere as steam. So that water does not return to its source. I mean, eventually via the water cycle, it's going to return, but this water is sent back out to the atmosphere in the short term. So this water is said to have been consumed. Metal and paper production also account for a large proportion of our water usage. Both of these processes use an extensive amount of water for multiple things. When you talk about water use in industry, you got to talk about the cleaning of machines in factories, you got to talk about cooling machines, lubricating machines, the actual production of the paper or the metal. So there's a lot of ways in industry that water gets used. And if we're going to do a quick comparison, there's a pretty broad range. So with paper, it uses let me go back. For the production of paper, you use about 33 gallons of water per kilo of paper produced, and then you can take that and stretch it all the way up to copper that uses 116 gallons of water per kilo to produce. So depending on what you're making, you're going to use more or less water, and like I said, in the metal and paper production industry, you're going to use water for a bunch of different things. And to kind of start wrapping up, we're going to bring it home to the household. Depending on what country you are in, just like everything else, your consumption is going to vary. In developed countries where you have got indoor water taps, you've got toilets, you've got showers, you've got washing machines, you've got dishwashers, obviously those countries are going to have a much higher per capita water consumption than areas of the world that don't even have indoor plumbing. So if you are in Kenya, you may use 11 gallons of water for a day. If you're in America, you're probably up somewhere around 150 gallons of water per day. So as far as indoor water usage goes, you can see a little breakdown there. Flushing the toilets consumes a large amount of water, as does washing clothes and showering. And then you got faucets. A good amount of water is lost to leaks, dishwashing, and then you've got irrigation. Now, if you live in an area that has got like really nice green lawns and outdoor swimming pools, you're going to use much, much more water, because the use of water to water those lawns and fill the swimming pool obviously is going to put you at a level much higher than somebody who does not have a lawn or a swimming pool. Two things to wrap up. If we talk about water conservation going forward, because water is a finite resource, there's only so much of it that is fresh in the world, so we got to look at taking care of it. Going on into the future, it is very possible that there are going to be wars fought over water, because water is a limited resource. Global population is growing, and scarce resources, growing population means that you can have conflict over water. This has already started in some areas. Last video we talked about India and Bangladesh fighting over water. In the Middle East, there have been conflicts over water, so it's a problem going forward. One solution that people have put forth is the idea that you can let market forces determine water prices and ownership. Right now, water is pretty much a resource that anybody can get a hold of and then distribute. The idea is that if companies are allowed to buy the rights to water and then sell water to the people, then a price will be put on water, because people are paying higher prices for water, they will use less water. But the problem with this is, what do you do when you've got an industry such as a big bottled water company buying a source of water, using all that water to make bottled water, shipping that water away to developed countries, and then telling the citizens that actually live in the country where that water is being bottled, oh, this water you got to pay for, when the people don't have the money to pay for it, or you can't use this water to irrigate it because we own it. So there's a couple ideas on the idea of water ownership. It's a highly controversial topic. We're going to talk more about it in class. I just kind of wanted you to have it in your head. And the last slide for the day is a couple of water conservation strategies. Appliance regulations. So over the last 20 or so years, the American government has made some steps towards putting regulation on the manufacture of appliances that consume water. So toilets have become quite a lot more efficient, as have shower heads and faucets. dishwashers, washing machines. Due to government regulation, we are now just using less water simply because our appliances are more efficient. With regard to landscaping, you've got options. You can either have a green lawn that takes a ton of water to maintain and keep them green and pretty, or you can go with xeriscaping. Xeriscaping is planting native plants rather than a lawn. Because you're planting plants that are native to that area, you aren't going to have to irrigate them because they're adapted to grow in whatever climate you live in. So rather than having a nice lush green lawn, you can go xeriscaping and use much less water. There are also home and industrial rainwater capturing systems. So you can put like a barrel next to the side of your house when it rains. You capture that rainwater, and then you can use that rainwater to irrigate your garden or your lawn. There's a big basketball stadium in Orlando, Florida. The whole roof of that thing collects water that goes into an underground cistern, and then that water is used throughout the stadium complex for irrigation and cleaning and things like that. And then in manufacture, companies have started to come up with more efficient ways to use water, whether it is reusing water or developing processes that use less water. So all this to say is that water is a finite resource. We cannot get more of it. It just keeps cycling around. So as the human population grows, we need to find ways to dramatically reduce the amount of water that we use. So that's what I got for today. Thanks for joining us on the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and we'll see you again.